The 100th episode of Changing the Face of Yoga will be released on the 22nd of May, 2019. My guest is Lee Blaschke, a longtime and extremely well-known yoga teacher and therapist internationally, and he will talk about how to keep the traditions of yoga and meet your current students' needs. Please join us. Hello, and welcome to Change the Face of Yoga, teaching toddlers through golden oldies. I'm very excited to be talking to lots of yoga teachers who will explain their passion for teaching yoga to students with different ages, physical fitness levels, wellness levels, and different goals. They will explain the benefits of yoga for these students and will be including teacher tips and pose modifications. I am Stephanie Cunningham of Yoga Lightness, and I've been teaching over 50s for 10 years. So this area is my passion and the passion of many other yoga teachers that you will be listening to in this series. Thank you so much for listening, and let's get started. This is episode 97 of Changing the Face of Yoga. And I have a very interesting guest today. Her name is Nikki DeSalvo. And Nikki is a Himalayan Institute trained Ayurvedic yoga specialist. Her business is Sweet Hearth Yoga, and it helps yoga students be at home with daily practice so they can live a fuller, more enjoyable life. She generally teaches students who are interested in Ayurvedic yoga as a part of their lifestyle, those that are interested in a more loving and evolved way to approach the human condition. Welcome, Nikki. And is there anything else that you would like to add to that introduction?
Thanks, Stephanie. It's really fun to be here with you. And there's so much to add, but maybe we can let that unfold through our conversation.
Okay, great. Let's start off with, I'm not really familiar with the Himalayan Institute. So could you kind of explain that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. It's important, I think, to identify the lineage that yoga teachers follow, and that maybe isn't a part of yoga conversation as much as it could be. And it makes a difference, I think. So the Himalayan Institute is located in eastern Pennsylvania. The tradition is one of the longest unbroken traditions of yoga, meaning that it was passed down from teacher to student, without any major breaks or interpretations in the philosophy. So that's important to me, in terms of the ways that we know and develop our wisdom. The teachings are consistent. That's really important to me. The Himalayan Institute teaches yoga, Ayurveda, and tantra really as one approach, and that's also really important to me. What more could I tell you about the tradition? There's a lot to say, and that's my nutshell for the moment.
Okay, good. So you're considering yourself, and I'm sure you are, an Ayurvedic yoga specialist. So I know a little bit about Ayurveda. I do not claim to be very knowledgeable about it, but how are you? I assume you were trained to put these two things together to come out with something that's bigger than both of them. So what are the important things about being an Ayurvedic yoga specialist?
Yeah, I love that question. So I am an Ayurvedic yoga specialist. I'm also enrolled in the Institute's Ayurvedic Yoga Therapy program. It's a 1,200-hour graduate level training. And at the end of that, I'll do pretty much what I do now with a lot more insight. So what it means to be an Ayurvedic yoga specialist, according to the Himalayan Institute, is to design yoga practices from the context of Ayurveda. So, teachers after they graduate their 200-hour training, they're out teaching yoga. It's not that their yoga instruction is not Ayurvedic. It most certainly is. They're just very likely unaware. So here's a great example. When we go to Bikram practices, those are really hot practices and they're wet, right? So whether we know that we're practicing in an Ayurvedic context or not, that's definitely happening. So what that training has done for me has given me a lot more clarity about the different types of needs and the different approaches to practice, especially across the lifespan and certainly through the seasons and definitely through the cycles of the day that students are managing through their practices and the types of challenges that they bring to practice. And my specialty is helping people establish daily practice. So whether yoga teachers know it or not, they're practicing Ayurveda when they suggest a breathing exercise or a longer hold or a faster vinyasa. They are operating through the lens of Ayurveda. So I think that this is really can't be emphasized enough because context is really important. I believe.
Okay. So would it be fair to say that what you're saying that really the basis of yoga is in Ayurveda? It's just that we may not be realizing it when we do our teaching. So let's just take that example that you gave me about big hot yoga, that it's hot and moist, and so that how do you wrap that up with Ayurveda so that I can understand it a little better?
Right. Well, let me just first clarify and say that that yogis do not consider yoga to be based in Ayurveda. They consider Ayurveda and yoga to be sister sciences, but you weren't incorrect in picking up on that nuance because I consider personally, just me, Nikki, I consider Ayurveda to be the big mama, yeah. And that all the yoga that we practice, ethics, breathing, practices, the postures, for me, they happen within the context. But yogis and Ayurveds, they consider the two philosophies as sister sciences. You'll hear that a lot if you do any sort of Google search or have conversation. So I just want to honor that that's generally how people approach. In terms of that hot yoga class, just to give you like a little Ayurveda 101.
Yes.
The basic premise of Ayurveda is that everything that comes into matter and into being possesses the qualities of 5 elements. And when we are moving through the universe and we're approaching the layers of ourselves, we run into evidence and the qualities of those elements in ourselves and everyone around us. So when we can identify that, whenever we can start to look at things in terms of sharp or dull, expansive or dense, right, light or dark, when we can look at those qualities and start to apply a little support with opposite therapy, when something has gotten too heavy, when it's too dark, we can bring in the qualities of light, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when teachers are creating classes, having a sense for what their students are most likely experiencing helps them make better choices. For example, I know that because of work practices, definitely here in the United States, but I would guess all the way around the world, folks are just working, 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 and the soonest they can get to their yoga class is in the early evening. But if we understand the Ayurvedic clock, and we know that the time of day when our endurance is at its lowest, right, is 2 to 6 p.m. That's Vata time, that's ether. It's probably not the best time of day to take a power class.
Okay, I see. All right, so when you're developing a class and you're taking all of this into consideration, how would your class look different than, say, just a regular class? What have you added or subtracted from it?
So just insight, really. I can tell you, you won't catch me teaching a vigorous class in the evening. That's the time of day when I want my students to start tuning into the sweetness of the evening, the heaviness of the day, and allow themselves to surrender to that natural rhythm so that they sleep really deeply. Because deep sleep is the single most effective way to build the vital essence of ojas, our life force, our endurance. And we need that. We need that to live prosperous, joyful, free lives, right? So to respect the cycles of nature and not to move against them outwardly would be one. But I'm glad that you asked the question because this really comes to play when I'm teaching survivors of domestic violence through my program, the Peaceful Life Project. One thing that people misunderstand about trauma, for example, and this is a hot topic in yoga these days, teaching trauma-informed yoga, is that when folks experience trauma, they express it really differently depending on their constitution. Not everyone experiences anxiety. Some people become very agitated and they deal with anger and aggression, and that is a form of trauma that they're expressing. Other people become super heavy and they deal with depression and fatigue, inability to take action and move forward. So those are 3 different ways, right, to be experiencing trauma. And when I design classes, I take that into consideration. You know, who's in this space? What is their constitution? What's the time of day that we're dealing with? Because in the evening, regardless of constitution, we all start to experience that heaviness and the wearing of our endurance, some more than others, some less, but we're all experiencing that.
Okay. So let's go into this unique program that you've put together called the Peaceful Life Project, which is Ayurvedic yoga for survivors. So this is for people who are survivors of domestic violence, or are they survivors of other types of trauma also?
Well, I would wager, given, you know, the state of humanity and society at this time, that we're pretty much all survivors of a level of domestic violence, that women really still aren't experiencing economic equity, that there's still so much violence, you know, in culture today, and that we all witness it and participate in it on some level. So I would say that that's all of us. But yes, specifically all of the forms of domestic violence. When people hear that term, they tend to just think physical violence. But the foundation of domestic violence is actually economic, and it's also legal. Many women who are in relationships that are abusive may not leave if they have children. And that's because court systems all around the globe, not just in the States, not just in Australia, you know, not just in Europe, but all around the globe, women still don't have the agency to leave their marriages and keep their children safe. Abusers are still able to retain their parental rights pretty well unchecked. And so in those cases, a lot of times women won't leave, or if they do, aspects of the abuse continue on for as long as the abuser has access to the children, because they use the child to commit DV by proxy. So that's a lot, right, to deal with for a really, really long time without much remedy. And that's why I created this program, because if someone is dealing with an intense drain on their resources for a very long time, they require more support. They require more resources than the average person. And survivors generally are not receiving even adequate support to meet their needs for safety. And so I created this program because Ayurveda and yoga don't ask anything of an individual other than we turn in to ourselves and pay attention. So it's a revolutionary program because of its accessibility. And I could just go on, but I'll just pause there because it's a lot to digest. And, I wonder how it lands with you and what questions you have about it.
Okay. Well, when you offer this through the Peaceful Life Project, are you going into like refuges, or are you offering it in just general classes, or how do you access someone who may need something like this?
Right. So there are a couple pieces to your question, and I'm really excited to talk about this aspect of the program because accessibility is incredibly important to me. So I'll let you know that when I was living in Pittsburgh and doing training through the Himalayan Institute small studio there, I was teaching yoga at one of the women's shelters. And at the time, I didn't know, I didn't conceive yet of this particular project. I was just learning how I could be a support to other survivors. I'm a survivor, but not everyone's like me. And that's a really important piece to remember, is that, we're not all, we don't all have the same experiences. So I was learning. So at the time I was going into shelters. Since moving back to the Carolinas, I have really started to contemplate and become aware of this issue of physical safety. And in approaching studios and facilities in my area, I was getting the same feedback from people. They were saying, well, like, what's the liability if we have survivors come into this space? Can we guarantee their safety? Can we guarantee the staff's safety? And sometime last year, you may or may not have seen in the news that a male entered a yoga space and executed several people, in that space, in that studio. And so not only, did I meet some hurdles in finding physical space in which to teach, I started to realize that survivors themselves may not necessarily feel that comfortable in studio spaces where they might be identified as survivors, or where they wouldn't be identified as survivors, and so they wouldn't receive the support that they need to feel good in the space. So I've had to start facing, my own learning curve challenges about moving into like this new technologic age where people like you and I are able to meet each other and connect, even though we live on two different points on the globe. And I find this really exciting because the program, as I'm preparing it and rolling it out, is 100% digital. So this means that shelters could purchase the program and that their residents could participate. And it means that individuals can purchase the program and that they can participate. It has a live component, which is still virtual. And then the survivors can practice in the safety of their own home. or wherever it is, that they are, and don't have to pay for childcare, which is a big thing for single solo mamas and survivors. Not only do you have to, shell out money for your studio clothes, but your studio membership, and then you've got to get childcare and make it to your classes. Virtually, participants of the Peaceful Life Project, they can practice in their sweatpants. And I hope that they do, because I want us all to live yoga, not just have it be an activity, but really it start to be part of our very fiber in our being, so that the practice reflects back to us who we are. So it's virtual, and also no survivors will be turned away for their inability to pay. There is a work exchange program that's really generous and easy to participate in. So accessibility.
Excellent. I didn't think about that, but you're right. That would be a problem to find a place that everybody felt safe. Okay, so really interesting. I'm impressed, Nikki. This is something we haven't done on the podcast about domestic violence survivors. It's always good to understand what the limitations might be, or the issues that might come up with different populations. So I really appreciate you talking about that. Can you go a bit into the work exchange, just to kind of give us an idea of what you mean by that?
Yeah, absolutely. Just a little bit on that, as it's still becoming concretized. But very generally, the program is a year long. And so the payments are broken up into a month at a time. And the work exchange involves a little bit of light marketing and fundraising. So each survivor receives a set of video trainings, and they also receive printed materials. And all that they need to do is set their own goals. So for example, if their monthly goal is to raise, let's say $225, they could decide that really what they want to do is just go out and find 12 donors who will give them $225 a piece. And that could be, and they might meet their goal in the first month. And they will be given all the materials they need to be successful at that. I have a background in fundraising. And this does several things for the program and the survivor. It supports the survivor because sometimes women leave the marriage and, they've been taking care of children, they've set aside a career, and so now they find themselves in a position where they don't really have work references or a skill set, for this modern day and age. And it's really difficult to jump into the workforce in your 30s and 40s. Mm-hmm. So this opportunity where they're doing work, it is a work exchange. Not only are they making sure that they can participate in the program, but they're also developing references and skill sets, that they're getting actual work training. So part of if I can just digress for just a moment and touch on it, part of the program, part of the tantra of this year-long experience is that we use the Ayurvedic yoga to address these 4 aims of life and their purpose: prosperity, freedom, and joy. And so doing this work exchange in several ways, starts to address those 4 aims in a real practical way. It's really helpful for the program as well, because whenever our participants are reaching out, they're educating the community about domestic violence, which is beautiful. Yeah. It fulfills so much purpose for them for the program and for the world, right? Because people start to understand what some of the real everyday challenges are for survivors, through this education. And then secondly, it does a little bit of basic marketing for us when we have a participant reaching out to their friends and family in their community. They're going to touch other survivors. They're going to touch people who know survivors, because the numbers of survivors it's so high, And so word is spread about the Peaceful Life Project in just, a really practical and gentle and easy and community building way. So a number of needs are met. The money gets raised. The survivor develops a skill set and builds some references, and the mission of the program gets spread around. So it's really just a synergy that's beyond win-win. And I just find that thrilling. I hope other people, feel excited about it too. But it was sort of a breakthrough for me to figure out how can we make sure that the program is funded, because my kids have to eat too, but also how can we make sure that everyone has access and can be successful?
Excellent. No, I think that's very clever. You put it together in a way that makes a lot of sense. We're almost at the end of the podcast, Nikki. Is there anything that you would like the listeners to know that we either haven't covered or haven't covered in enough depth?
Yeah, I think that I would like people in general to know that survivors come in all shapes and sizes, every demographic you can imagine. And for survivors themselves, I realize that there's a challenge in even taking on that label. Throughout my marriage, there were many times where I said to myself, hey, that's really abusive. But there were 0 times that I ever said, I am being abused. Can you believe that? There was like this necessary disconnect. So when listeners hear this information, I would just ask, that you turn into your yoga practice and notice, what bubbles forth for you, what sensations you experience, what qualities, what is your breath like? Does it have skips and pauses in it? Is it smooth? Is it deep? And really pay attention to what comes up for you around this idea of domestic violence and survivorship, because so many of us are impacted directly and indirectly, that this program has a lot to offer everyone, really. But who might identify as a survivor and who might not, that question begins a conversation. It's a really personal conversation, but I would just ask that people open their heart and turn into their practice.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Nikki. I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. I think you brought up some incredible information and compassion. Just thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me, Stephanie. I'm just feeling really excited and on fire, about this project. And I really enjoy the opportunity to talk with people who care. So thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Thank you for that wonderful interview. If you would like to be a guest on Changing the Face of Yoga, please go to my website, www.yogalightness.com.au, and under the Changing the Face of Yoga tab, you can complete Be Our Guest form. After reviewing the form and finding it applicable to this podcast, we will send you a link to schedule an interview. Please download, review, and tell your friends of any podcasts that are of interest to you and to them. If you would like to contact me, send an email to info@yogalightness.com.au. And thank you for listening to Changing the Face of Yoga.